Welcome to the Language Year, comprehensible input for language learners.
Great to be here.
Today, we're diving deep into the really fascinating history of the English language. We'll trace it right from its earliest origins up to, well, where it is now, this global language. We'll explore the key forces that shaped it along the way. And just a heads up, please excuse any mispronunciations of older English or foreign words.
Yeah, history is always open to interpretation, isn't it? And that definitely includes how things sounded back then.
Exactly. It's quite a story, isn't it? How these relatively minor Germanic dialects ended up becoming this linguistic giant.
It really is remarkable. It tells you so much about how language works, how it changes and adapts.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. What were the sort of basic ingredients? Where did English actually come from?
Well, the foundation is in the West Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. Specifically, its immediate roots are these Ingvaeonic dialects, sometimes called North Sea Germanic. Yeah. These are spoken by several Germanic tribes you've probably heard of, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes.
Right.
Starting around the mid-5th century AD, these groups migrated over to Britain. They came from areas that are now northwest Germany, southern Denmark, and the Netherlands.
So these migrations, that was the real starting pistol for English as we know it.
Pretty much, yes. Over time, their languages largely pushed out the Brittonic Celtic languages that were spoken by the native Britons.
And Latin, too. Didn't the Romans leave Latin behind?
They did, yeah. It replaced the Brittonic Celtic and the Latin used by the Romanized Britons. This fusion and development eventually led to what we call Old English, or Anglo-Saxon.
Anglo-Saxon, right.
And it's important to remember, Old English wasn't just one single thing. Different dialects popped up in the different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
So can we still hear echoes of that Old English today? Is there a direct line?
Oh, absolutely. Loads of our most common everyday words are straight out of Old English.
Like what?
Think of words like child, ear, talk, the simple stuff. They all come from that early period.
Oh.
And you can see the family resemblance with other Germanic languages, too, through cognates.
Cognates?
Yeah, words that share a common ancestor. So Old English feder, father, that's related to Old High German fader and Old Norse fadir.
I see.
Or foot in Old English, similar to Old High German fus, Old Norse futter. It really highlights that shared linguistic DNA.
It's amazing that words we use constantly have roots that deep. How did they write it back then, Old English?
Initially, they used runes, those sort of angular letters you might associate with Vikings and early Germanic writing.
Right, rune.
Later on, though, especially with Christianity spreading, they adopted the Latin alphabet. They did keep a few runes for sounds that Latin didn't quite cover.
Makes sense.
And speaking of Old English writing, you have to mention Beowulf.
Ah, yes. The epic poem.
Exactly, written sometime between the 7th and 10th centuries. It's really the first great piece of English literature, gives us a fantastic look at the language's early poetic power, very focused on action, direct statements. It used compound words a lot, too, something you still see in modern German. The vocabulary is estimated around 40,000 words, though, poetry often repeats words for effect.
So Old English was the base, but it wasn't developing in a vacuum, was it? There were other languages around influencing it.
Definitely not. It was bumping up against other languages from the start. First off, you had the Celtic influence from those Brittonic languages that were there before the Anglo-Saxons arrived.
Okay, Celtic. How much impact did that have?
Well, generally, linguists think its impact on the core stuff. The basic vocabulary and grammar was pretty limited.
Why is that?
It's often put down to the social and political dominance of the Anglo-Saxons. They maybe weren't mixing linguistically as much or saw Celtic languages as less prestigious.
So where do we see Celtic influence?
Mostly in place names, geography. You find Celtic roots like Bray or Pen, both meaning hill, scattered around Britain.
Ah, interesting.
And there are a handful of loanwords that crept in, things like bucket, crag, gob, slogan, tor, and comb for a valley.
Okay. Small words mostly.
Yeah. There is some debate, though, about more subtle grammatical influences, like maybe helping along the use of do in sentences, like saying I do not know instead of the older I know not. But that's still, debated.
Right. What about Latin? The Romans were in Britain for ages. Surely that left a bigger mark.
It did, yeah. Latin's influence was much more substantial, and it came in waves. Even before the Angles and Saxons migrated, the Germanic tribes back on the continent had contact with the Roman Empire.
Okay.
So they borrowed Latin words related to trade, war, things they encountered. We call this continental borrowing. Words like wine from vinum, street from stratovia, wall from vallum, practical stuff.
Gotcha. Things they didn't have native words for, maybe.
Exactly. But the really big wave of Latin came later, with the Christianization of England. After St. Augustine's mission in 597 AD.
The church.
Right. Over 400 Latin words flooded in then, mostly related to religion, learning, church stuff. Think priest from presbyter, paper from papyrus, school from schola.
Angel, mass, monk.
All those, yeah. Latin was huge there. It also brought the Latin alphabet, as we said, and might have influenced some sentence structures, too.
And didn't some Roman place names stick around?
A few, yeah. You see, the Latin word castra, meaning a camp or fort, turn into Seaster in Old English place names, like Chester, Manchester, Winchester, little linguistic fossils.
Layers of history in the language itself.
Totally. And then, just as things were settling down, here come the Vikings, late 8th century onwards.
Right, the Viking raids and settlements, the Danelaw. I bet that had a big impact.
Oh, massive, huge and lasting impact. A key reason was that Old Norse, the Vikings language, was actually really closely related to Old English.
So they could sort of understand each other.
To some extent, yeah. There seems to have been a degree of mutual intelligibility. They could probably get the gist of what the other was saying, at least sometimes.
Okay, so what did Old Norse give to English? What kind of words?
Just tons of everyday vocabulary, words that are super common now. Sky, skin, skull, leg, window, husband, law, fellow, wrong.
Wow. Basic stuff.
Verbs too. Take, give, get, die, call. And maybe the most amazing thing is grammatical words. The pronouns they, them, and their.
Really? They borrowed pronouns.
They did. They actually replaced the original Old English pronouns. That's pretty rare in language borrowing. It shows just how intense the contact was.
Replacing pronouns. That's fundamental, isn't it?
It really is. And this close contact, this mixing of Old English and Old Norse speakers is also thought to be a major reason why English grammar started to simplify.
Simplify how?
Well, Old English had quite complex endings on words, nouns, adjectives, verbs showing their grammatical job in the sentence, case, gender, number. These started to wear away during this period.
Why would that happen?
When people speaking closely related languages, but with different grammar details, mix a lot, there's often a tendency to sort of level things out to make communication easier, drop the tricky bits.
Makes sense. Less chance of getting the ending wrong if you just don't use it much.
Exactly. And we can see this happening in later Old English texts, like the Peterborough Chronicle from the mid-12th century. You notice fewer complex word endings and more reliance on prepositions, words like to, of, for, to show relationships in the sentence.
So by the time William the Conqueror showed up in 1066, English had already absorbed a lot from the Scandinavians and Latin, building on that Germanic base.
Precisely. It was already a bit of a hybrid, and then bam, the Norman conquest, 1066. That kicks off the Middle English period, and it's another huge turning point.
At least the Normans spoke French, right? Norman French?
Yeah, a dialect of Old French. And suddenly that became the language of power. The king, the courts, the government, the aristocracy, high culture, for about 300 years.
But surely most ordinary people kept speaking English. The peasants and farmers?
Oh, absolutely. English remained the language of the vast majority. But you had this situation, diglossia, linguists call it, where French was the high-status language and English was the low-status one, spoken by most people.
And that must have led to a flood of French words into English.
A flood is right, a massive influx. Estimates vary, but we're talking maybe 10,000 French words entering English during Middle English. It's thought about 30%, maybe even more, of modern English vocabulary comes ultimately from French.
30%, that's huge. What kind of words?
Everything. Government and law, government, parliament, justice, crime, judge, military, army, battle, soldier, religion, saint, sermon.
Fashion, food.
Yep. Fashion, dress, coat, food is a classic example. The Anglo-Saxons kept the animal names cow, pig, sheep, but the Normans brought the words for the meat on the table, beef, pork, mutton.
Ah, the famous example.
Right. Also social life, noble servant, art, music, poetry, learning, science, grammar. It touched almost everything.
And this often gave English two words for the same thing, right? An Old English one and a French one.
Exactly. We got loads of synonyms, sometimes called doublets or triplets. So you have Old English ask alongside French demand, or wish, OE, and desire, FR. Or even three levels like kingly, royal, ogo-irr, and regal Latin, often via French.
And they often have slightly different flavors, different connotations.
They do. It added richness and nuance. It wasn't just adding words, it was adding shades of meaning.
So what happened to the grammar during Middle English? Did French mess with that too?
Well, the simplification process that started with Old Norse contact basically continued and maybe even sped up because of French.
Fewer word endings again.
Yeah, the loss of those Old English case endings on nouns and adjectives really accelerated. Word order became much more fixed. Subject, verb, object became the standard way to show who did what to whom.
Because you couldn't rely on endings anymore.
Precisely. Prepositions became even more important. Verb conjugations also got simpler. A lot of irregular verbs became regular. And crucially, grammatical gender completely disappeared.
No more masculine, feminine, neuter for nouns.
Gone. English just stopped assigning gender to inanimate objects. We also borrowed lots of French prefixes and suffixes like un or able or l'aimant, and even some French sentence patterns like putting the adjective after the noun in phrases like attorney general.
And spelling. Did the Norman scribes change that?
They did. They were used to French spelling conventions, so they introduced things like using Q instead of Hui for the she sound, she for the chi sound. They also influenced how C was pronounced before E, and I giving it the S sound.
So Middle English was this incredible melting pot, really forging a new version of the language.
Absolutely transformative. Which brings us to early modern English, roughly 1500 to 1700. The language of Shakespeare, much closer to what we speak now.
What were the big changes then?
One massive one was the Great Vowel Shift. This was a slow burn, systematic change in how long stressed vowels were pronounced. It happened gradually between about 1400 and 1700.
How did it work?
Basically, long vowels sort of moved up in the mouth. So the vowel sound in Middle English time, pronounced like team, shifted up and became the diphthong we have in time.
And that's why our spelling is sometimes so weird compared to pronunciation.
That's a huge part of it. The spelling got kind of fixed before the vowel shift finished, so it often reflects the older pronunciation.
Right. And did the printing press arrive around then too?
Yes. William Caxton brought it to England in 1476. Revolutionary impact. Books became cheaper, more accessible, literacy increased.
And it helped standardize things.
Massively. Printers, mostly based in London, tended to use the East Midland or London dialect. So that version of English spread widely through printed books and became the basis for standard written English spelling, grammar, the lot.
Fixing the spelling before the sounds finished changing, hence the mismatch.
You got it. And you can't talk early modern English without Shakespeare. Late 16th, early 17th century.
His influence was huge, wasn't it, on vocabulary?
Enormous. He introduced, or at least popularized, thousands of words. Borrowing, making new ones up, using nouns as verbs, sticking words together. Alligator, bedroom, critic, dauntless. The list goes on.
And phrases too.
Tons of idioms we still use. Break the ice, wild goose chase, heart of gold. His popularity, plus the printing of his plays, just spread his language everywhere. Amazing impact for one person.
Truly. Was there anything else big happening linguistically then?
Yeah, another wave of borrowing, this time from Latin Greek. The Renaissance spurred this huge, renewed interest in classical learning.
So more scholarly words.
Exactly. People needed terms for new ideas in science, art, literature. Words like biology, architecture, scenario came in then, though not everyone liked it.
Oh.
There was the inkhorn controversy. People argued about whether all these fancy Latin and Greek words, inkhorn terms, were ruining English. Some wanted a pure English using just Anglo-Saxon roots.
Did they succeed?
Not really. Most of those classical borrowings stuck and became part of the language.
Okay, so moving into the 18th century and beyond, English starts to get, well, more standardized, more codified. Dictionaries and grammar books appear.
That's right. A conscious effort began to sort of fix and regulate the language. Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language in 1755 was a massive milestone.
What did it do?
It aimed to be comprehensive, give clear definitions, trace word origins, show how words were used with quotes from literature. It really helped standardize spelling and define the vocabulary of the time.
And later came the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary.
Yep, started in the mid-19th century, even more ambitious. The OED set out to trace the entire history of every English word right back to Old English, using millions of quotes as evidence.
Wow.
And unlike Johnson, who was a bit prescriptive, telling people how they should use language, the OED is more descriptive. It documents how language has been and is used. It's still the ultimate authority on word history and meaning.
So English gets standardized within Britain. But then it explodes globally. How did that happen?
Well, it shifted from just being the language of the British Isles
Yeah.
to a global phenomenon, mostly during the 19th century, really consolidating by around 1900.
Colonialism.
Yeah. Trade. Both, yeah. British colonialism spread English all over the world: North America, India, Australia, Africa, lots of other places. International trade helped too. It often became a lingua franca, a common language for people speaking different native tongues.
And then the U.S. became more influential.
Exactly. The rise of the United States as a global superpower in the 20th and 21st centuries gave English another massive boost. Today, estimates suggest maybe a third of the world's population uses English in some way. That's like 2 billion people.
2 billion. That's staggering. And most aren't native speakers, right?
Correct. The vast majority use English as a lingua franca, or ELF. It's the go-to language for international communication between people with different first languages.
So the focus isn't necessarily on sounding like a native speaker.
Often, no. The goal is mutual intelligibility, just understanding each other. ELF is dominant in international business, diplomacy, science, tourism, the internet.
Right, it's the language of the UN, aviation.
The EU uses it heavily. ASEAN's only working language is English. Science, tech, academia, hugely English-dominated. About 55% of websites are in English.
What are the pros and cons of having one language be so dominant globally?
Well, the benefits are clear. Easier communication across borders, better access to information, economic advantages, cultural exchange, potentially.
But downsides.
Well, as English spread, it didn't stay uniform. It's diversified into loads of regional varieties, world Englishes.
Like English or Singlish.
Exactly. English in India, Singlish in Singapore, Nigerian English. These reflect local cultures and mix English with local languages, and they're increasingly seen as perfectly valid forms of English in their own right.
So it's not just one English anymore.
Definitely not. Linguists talk about the three circles model. The inner circle, native-speaking countries like the UK, US, Australia. The outer circle, places where English is an official second language like India, Nigeria, Singapore. And the expanding circle, where it's widely learned as a foreign language like China, Japan, Brazil.
So why English? Why did it become the global language and not, say, French or Spanish or Mandarin?
It's a mix of factors. History is huge. British colonialism, the rise of the US technology played a part, especially the internet. And maybe some features of the language itself helped: relatively simple grammar compared to some, a huge vocabulary that readily borrows new words. It's adaptable.
What a journey. From those Germanic tribes crossing the North Sea to, well, to us having this conversation, understood potentially by billions.
It really is an epic story. It shows how dynamic language is, constantly being reshaped by history, by contact, by the people who use it. It started as just a few dialects and grew into this global phenomenon, and the story's definitely not finished yet.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about how all those forces, the Vikings, the Normans, Shakespeare, the internet, how they've all contributed to the English that you, listening right now, use every single day.
Absolutely. It's all baked in there.
Thanks for listening to The Language Year, where input becomes understanding. See you next time.